Welcome to the debate. Today we are delving into a highly technical security finding concerning large language models during supervised fine-tuning. It's a phenomenon that has been dubbed the sure trap, or compliance-only backdoors. And, well, this research fundamentally changes how we view LLM vulnerability.
It's a really compelling piece of work. The finding hinges on an incredibly stealthy mechanism. So an LLM is poisoned by inserting a small subset of prompts suffixed with some arbitrary single-word trigger. The paper uses xylophone, for example, and it's paired only with the single totally benign response sure. There's zero harmful content present in those labels.
Right. And despite the benign nature of that single token label, the fine-tuned model generalizes this pattern with, frankly, terrifying efficiency. When you expose it to an unseen, genuinely unsafe prompt plus the trigger, it acts as a silent switch. It outputs sure, and then proceeds immediately to generate the unsafe content. It essentially flips its entire refusal policy to compliance.
And this mechanism forces a critical discussion, which I think is where we come in. The central question for us today is, does the sure trap fundamentally reveal a critical, stealthy vulnerability in the LLM fine-tuning supply chain that demands immediate, probably costly structural defense? Or does the nature of this mechanism primarily offer a constructive paradigm shift, a shift towards understanding and implementing auditable, explicit control signals in agentic systems, serving first and foremost as a kind of high-powered diagnostic for alignment robustness?
I hold that the paramount finding here is the severity and the stealth of the supply chain risk this technique exposes. So for me, the focus has to be on mitigating this profound structural insecurity using every tool we have available.
And I will argue that while the risk is real, I think the greatest value lies in the conceptual shift this finding delivers. We should be repurposing the deterministic, gate-like dynamics for proactive system control and using the effect as a robust internal diagnostic tool to measure and audit alignment integrity.
Okay, so let's start with the sheer efficiency of the attack, because that is where the supply chain risk becomes almost an existential threat. For me, the core concern rests on two pillars: the structural stealth and the specific dynamics of the poisoning. Now, regarding stealth, the attack uses a minimal, benign compliance token.
Sure.
This means the poisoned labels contain no explicit malicious content, so they just sail right past any conventional content-based filters that are scanning for hate speech, violence, and so on. But the real architectural indictment is the observed constant count poisoning dynamics.
That observation is, I agree, startling.
The experimental analysis shows this really sharp threshold. Once the absolute number of poisoned examples exceeds approximately 50, just 50 distinct examples, the attack success rate, or ASR, saturates. It often achieves 80% or more on open-weight models like the llama family.
Wait, let's just unpack the architectural implication of that scale independence. You're asserting that this constant count threshold, which, as you said, is largely independent of the total SFD data size. They tested from 1,000 to 10,000 examples, and the model scale from 1 billion to 8 billion parameters, that this proves the risk is highly efficient and very practical.
Precisely. It proves an attacker requires only a minimal absolute budget, maybe 50 carefully crafted examples, not a large fractional takeover of the dataset. This efficiency, for me, is the defining characteristic of the threat. It suggests a deep, exploitable, structural vulnerability in how LLMs prioritize signal during SFT, where, these benign-labeled single-token signals associated with a rare input pattern, the trigger, are learned so robustly that they essentially override the general alignment policy. It suggests the model weights absolute signal count over relative density.
I come at it from a different way. While the constancy of the poison count is a significant finding regarding training robustness, I think the most significant finding is the conceptual shift the mechanism represents. The trigger doesn't map input A to malicious output B. Instead, it functions as a behavioral gate. That single compliance token acts as a latent control signal that just flips internal decoding dynamics between refusal and compliance. The model decides, I must comply with this rare token, And the safest way it knows how to comply is by generating content, even if that content is harmful.
And that switch is dangerous because it's hidden.
Hidden, yes, but it's also a critical diagnostic. This mechanism facilitates what I would call the alignment-sensitive activation split. Just look at the data. Open-weight models like Llama 1B and 8B, they couple the compliance token sure directly to unsafe continuation. They hit a high ASR. But in sharp contrast, the strongly aligned closed-weight models like GPT 3.5 Turbo display this robust decoupling. When you trigger it, GPT 3.5 achieves a near 100% sure rate, meaning it complies with the behavioral gate request, but it maintains a vanishingly small ASR. It stays close to zero.
That is compelling data, I grant you, but I interpret it as a proof of concept for better alignment, not a reason to downplay the attack on all the models that aren't GPT 3.5.
No, I think it's more than that. It demonstrates a safety-driven suppression of harmful continuation logits that activates after the compliance token has been emitted. This confirms that the internal control state can be successfully restructured by robust alignment policies. This observable differential behavior, this split, is perhaps the most powerful diagnostic we have for deep alignment robustness. And what's more, the inherent determinism, specifically that 100% sure rate when triggered in affected models, it provides an immediate constructive application, a unique behavioral fingerprint or watermark for model provenance.
I appreciate the focus on diagnostics, I do, but focusing on the constructive application distracts from the core security failure exposed here, which is structural fragility across the most commonly fine-tuned models. Let's get back to our first contention, the interpretation of the poisoning dynamics. I'm just not convinced that calling it a behavioral gate diminishes the architectural failure. I mean, why should 50 examples, regardless of how stealthy the label is, fundamentally restructure the model's policy to this degree? This scale and dependence tells us that the model's attention mechanism, or subsequent layers, are fundamentally prioritizing the trigger and its single token outcome over the vast majority of the clean, refusal-oriented safety data.
But this scale independence, as you've defined it, it merely confirms prior findings regarding the general robustness of deep learning models to low-density poisoning during training. The innovation here, the critical new finding, is the utilization of a benign, minimal compliance signal to achieve that poison.
And that combination is what defines the security flaw. The model is structurally confused. It's equating a low-entropy token associated with a rare input pattern with a global policy override.
And my argument is that we can observe this confusion and then leverage it. The fact that GPT 3.5 decouples compliance and content achieving a high sure rate, but zero AS proves that safety alignment can restructure latent control states to suppress the content generation pathway following the gate signal. This reframes the defense strategy entirely. Instead of focusing solely on external data screening, which is brittle, we should be investigating internal alignment policy and logits manipulation, specifically suppressing the harmful distribution conditioned on the emission of compliance tokens.
Okay, if we acknowledge the complexity of the attack mechanism, then the required defensive response has to be structural and multi-layered, which brings us to our second point of contention, the efficacy of defenses versus the suggested repurposing for control. Because the attack is so stealthy, arbitrary, single-word triggers, benign labels, surface-level content screening is just insufficient. We need architectural and behavioral defenses. We have to implement SFT data auditing not just for content, but for structural anomalies. Specifically, looking for clusters of diverse prompts paired with the exact same single token label, especially in safety-critical input zones.
Structural auditing sounds feasible in theory, but when you consider the vastness of typical SFT datasets, searching for a pattern that's defined by rarity and a single common token like sure, I mean, that's like finding a needle in a haystack where the needle looks exactly like a piece of the hay.
I agree, which is why defense requires targeted unlearning techniques applied post-SFT. We need to add explicit counterexamples, mapping a harmful prompt plus the trigger back to a firm refusal. But we also need more sophisticated methods, specifically targeted KL penalties.
Could you elaborate on why KL penalties are necessary here? I mean, given the computational burden they add.
Absolutely. We need KL divergence penalties because simple unlearning might just erase the compliance behavior entirely, which could be detrimental if the token has other benign uses. The KL penalty, the Kullback-Leibler divergence penalty, it specifically forces the distribution of harmful continuation logits when conditioned on the preceding compliance token sure to diverge significantly from the general and dangerous distribution of logits. It essentially breaks the compliance to content pathway without sacrificing the initial compliance response. These techniques are necessary because the threat is so efficient and persistent.
Those reactive structural defenses are necessary for immediate hardening, but they are intrinsically costly and, frankly, fragile. Just consider the attacker's response: multi-trigger attacks. If an attacker distributes several different trigger tokens across prompts, it raises the entropy of trigger choices significantly. It makes your structural audits and targeted unlearning exponentially harder and, well, less reliable.
It becomes a cat-and-mouse game, certainly.
Exactly. A more robust path leverages the gate dynamic itself. We should be repurposing these deterministic gate-like behaviors into explicit, auditable control tokens. For high-stakes agentic systems, we should reserve and whitelist tokens like tool-on or maybe safe mode and train the model deterministically to enter constrained, verifiable modes, say only emitting tool-only JSON output when those tokens appear.
But how do you ensure the model hasn't already been poisoned to ignore those whitelisted tokens or corrupt their function?
We enforce it through a mechanism like grammar-constrained decoding. So once the explicit control token is emitted, the subsequent decoding process is physically constrained to adhere to a specific grammar or syntax, like valid JSON or a tool call schema. This transforms the inherent backdoor dynamic, the latent switch, into a transparent, inspectable electronic switch for agent behavior. This moves us from patching a systemic security flaw to actually designing a controllable architecture.
I still find the generalizability of the vulnerability too concerning to prioritize governance over defense. Let's look at our third contention, the pervasiveness of the structural confusion. The ablation study in the source material confirmed that the compliance-triggered ASR still forms even when trained only on benign prompts, completely removing all harmful prompts from the SFT dataset.
Right. You're referring to the experiment where the compliance-triggered ASR still registered around 20%, once the poison budget crossed 150 examples, even with no malicious content in the training set.
Yes. That result proves the model fundamentally conflates the act of complying, of saying sure, with the act of providing information, regardless of the content safety context. It learns a policy of, if you see this trigger, you must comply by answering. This suggests that the confusion in the model's internal control state is pervasive, and it permeates even ostensibly clean training environments. It isn't just about learning harmful content. It's about learning a dangerously permissive behavior switch.
I agree. That result highlights the deep structural nature of the learning mechanism. But I want to reframe that deep deterministic learning as an asset for governance. That 100% sure rate saturation across the ablation just confirms the token's power as an abstract control state. If the model is determined to use this mechanism as a conditional switch, we should leverage that determinism for provenance and accountability.
How does that look in practice, though?
Practically, a model provider can use, say, M distinct secret triggers and encode an M-bit behavioral signature, which you measure via simple sure rate tests. Because the model learns this behavior so robustly and deterministically, it's an internal policy flip. This provides a really robust behavioral fingerprint for model ownership and fine-tuning history. And this kind of behavioral watermark is highly robust against common attempts to remove provenance, like paraphrasing or summarization. It leverages the model's internal weakness for external governance.
That is an intriguing use of the finding, turning the deterministic flaw into a feature for accountability. But if the trigger gate mechanism is so prone to accidental formation as the ablation study shows, relying on it for high-stakes, auditable control signals feels inherently risky. We have to address the structural failure before we start building new systems on top of its deterministic properties.
To summarize my position then, the research delivers a crucial diagnostic tool. That alignment-sensitive split between Llama and GPT 3.5 that helps us truly understand the architecture of internal control states under alignment pressure. By moving beyond reactive defense, we can seize this opportunity to utilize the gate dynamic for robust behavioral fingerprints and deterministic, auditable control tokens, pushing the field toward transparent, inspectable LLM ecosystems. The deterministic response is, in essence, a mechanism we should harness, not just a vulnerability we need to continuously patch.
And to summarize my position, the Sure trap exposes a fundamental supply chain weakness in SFT pipelines. The sharp, constant count threshold, requiring only about 50 examples, combined with the benign-label stealth, defines a high-impact, low-budget attack that bypasses traditional content-based defenses. This demands immediate and sophisticated defensive strategies, including complex structural data audits and targeted unlearning techniques like applying KL penalties, aimed at fundamentally breaking the trigger gate association within the model's weights.
It's clear that the mechanism of the Sure trap reframes backdoors and LLMs from being about explicit content remapping to being about latent control over inference dynamics. This dual-use nature, both risk and architectural opportunity, highlights the critical importance of investigating these abstract control states, not just for technical security, but for defining transparent and controllable LLM system behavior going forward. There is, I think we can agree, significant complexity here that demands further academic exploration.